Hello, and welcome to another episode of Spot Talk. Today we're going to discuss Iran and how the Marxist left fared in the test posed by the US bombing of Iran. With me to discuss it is Comrade Elizabeth. Hello, Comrade.
Hi, Comrade Mansa.
Okay, so we've just put out this statement titled Iran Under Attack, Marxists Who Failed the Test. And in it, our purpose is to explain and maybe scandalize the fact that the left and the workers' movement didn't play a role. And we want to provoke a debate because, as everybody knows, we're just on the threshold of this period of turmoil. More chaos is looming. And Iran really was a wake-up call for the Marxist left and how it needs to get its house in order. It needs to get its act together. Because what we saw was really no coherence in terms of a Marxist position on this question. So what I want to do in this episode is talk about what was this war in order to explain how different tendencies within the Marxist movement failed this test.
Absolutely. I want to start by agreeing strongly with your point that we should scandalize the left and really make a debate on this question, because what happened was complete outrage. If you look at what the situation was in Iran, here is Israel starting to bomb Iran. Why? It's an extension of the war that they started against the Palestinians on October 7th. It's really moving to make sure that there's no counterweight or opposition to Zionist expansion in the region. And Israel is really acting as a spearhead to American interests when they started this war. Iran having been going back to the overthrow of the Shah, like a thorn in the U.S.'s side in the region.
Yeah, absolutely. And somehow the question of Palestine somehow disappears from the analysis of this war. You know, everybody gets all really worked up about, the character of this regime and the character of that regime, and they're both terrible regimes. But let's be concrete. What led to Israel bombing Iran was this whole question of Palestine.
I think that's true. And if I can just jump in, I think there's really a political reason for that, because it's very embarrassing for the left to admit you're not going to have a side against Israel if you admit that one of the key causes driving this war is the national oppression of the Palestinians.
Absolutely.
Of course, the way Israel maintains its position and helps the U.S. and the imperialists in the region.
Precisely. And I think it puts them in a bit of a bind because, of course, the whole left has been pro-Palestine since the genocide. I mean, in general, but it's like, well, this poses a bit of a test for your, for your claim that you're standing for Palestinian liberation. Okay, so war of aggression against Iran. Our basic position, the day this happened, we put out a statement saying workers stand with Iran and Palestine. Right. So for us, the very basic, most elementary position to take in this war was to defend Iran.
Absolutely. This was a war of conquest and oppression on the part of Israel, later joined by U.S. imperialism, the power that dominates and controls the whole world. What was it the Iranian government was fighting for? It was fighting to defend itself against this attack. Imagine if Iran had not fought back against Israel, the outcome would have been much worse.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we proceed, do want to just mention the RCIT, the Revolutionary Communist International tendency, who in our view is one of the only other tendencies who took a correct principled stance and actually took a stand in defense of Iran, but also correctly made polemics against those other Marxists who failed this. So shout out to the RCIT. But overwhelmingly, the Marxist left failed this test. So now what we want to start doing is go through the various ways in which they failed it, because not everybody had the same take, but ultimately it all landed them in the same side, right, of the problem. Why don't we start by talking about within Iran itself? Because, the Iranian regime is oppressive, of course. There's no doubt about this. We had the murder of Mahsa Amini a couple of years ago and a huge movement. And the left within Iran, of course, I think it was under this pressure of figuring out, okay, well, what do we do? Our country's under attack, but we really hate this regime. And I think that pressure was tremendous, but they were not able to deal with it properly. So why don't we start by talking about what was the task of Marxists within Iran itself?
I think that's absolutely true. And I think the starting point for Marxists in the left needed to be, first of all, opposition to imperialism, because in reality, the poverty and backwardness of Iran, the brutality of the regime, the oppression of women, the division and oppression of the various religious and national minorities in that country is a product of imperialist domination of the region, the strangulation of the country, and going back even to the colonial carve-up of the borders that they exist right now. So the elementary starting point for any kind of progress in the region is the struggle against imperialism. So from that starting point, then I think the question is also to understand that the regime itself is an obstacle to the struggle against imperialism. And if you look at, for example, very concretely, since October 7th, the role that the regime has played in the region and stood by and did basically nothing while the Palestinians were slaughtered, while its allies in Hezbollah were decapitated by Israel, and it had finally put up some token resistance. But in reality, the regime itself refusal to take a stand against Israel and try and mobilize for the Palestinians is part of the reason why Iran ended up in this position of being so isolated inside the region.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm going to say a couple of things. One of the criticisms that we've gotten since this war happened is you guys just back the regime, right? We'll get to that later. But there's this confusion in the left that if you say defend Iran, you are supporting this reactionary regime. Now, that is to understand nothing of what it means to struggle against imperialism. But I think more fundamentally, we do make the point about, look, we have fundamental difference with this regime, right? And as you just laid out, like, to be concrete about this. I think the other thing that people miss is that who has had the upper hand in this conflict this whole time? Israel. Israel decides when it's going to go on the offensive. Like Iran and the axis of resistance, they're always in a position of responding to things, right? Like, okay, what do we do now that Israel's done this? So the sort of anti-imperialism of the regime is quite hollow because indeed it's not mobilized a broader struggle against the Zionist and imperialist aggression against the Palestinians, but against the region as a whole.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And I think if you look at the reason for it, in fact, because of the very nature of the regime itself, it's not able to mobilize the kind of defense that you need to really push back the hand of U.S. imperialism or the Israelis in the region. The reality is this regime, it's based on the Mullahs, and it's based on the kind of chauvinist nationalism Persian majority within Iran and also the oppression of women. So this is not a basis where you can really mobilize an alliance, first of all, with workers in the United States or in the other Western imperialist countries, which is Marxist. Obviously, what we seek to do is to mobilize that kind of social power to push back and hold the hands of the imperialists. Or also within the broader region where the majority of the population is Sunni, and Arab or Turk, or in the other countries, other national. So really all of those narrow interests, and also their beholdenness to the privileges and the property of the elite in the country, prevent this regime from being able to really bring the masses of the region to their feet in an alliance to defend the country against the imperial.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, we, like you've just explained, those are fundamental differences and they're rooted in its kind of actual class nature of this regime. But nonetheless, Iran, as you laid out, has been oppressed by U.S. imperialism. And when U.S. imperialism decides to bomb it, or when the Zionist entity decides to bomb it, the most elementary thing is to take a side. So now within Iran, the left did not take this position. Could you go over kind of what were the different trends that we saw within the Iranian left?
Well, absolutely. I mean, there were two main, I think, mistakes in addressing this very real problem that the Iranian left came up with. One mistake was to refuse to defend Iran in this onslaught on the basis that if you defend Iran, the regime is going to benefit and the regime is going to be stronger. So I think it helps on this question to take a step back and look at it. What is it that actually strengthens the regime? Obviously, as Marxists, we are for the overthrow of the Iranian regime, but the basis to overthrow it for us is not U.S. imperialism, regime change, which of course has been a disaster in countless examples around the world for the whole population of the country, but bringing the masses, the toiling masses, really to their feet. So how do you do that? Well, for starters, if you're a communist in Iran and you refuse to defend the country being bombed by Israel or the United States, there's no reason the masses are going to listen to you.
Exactly. Like, why? Why should we listen to you?
You're not even going to be seen as their defender.
Exactly.
Another wrong answer, I think, that the left comes to, we're talking about the mistakes in responding to the situation of the left. The other wrong answer that the left comes to is to simply support the regime. Oh, the regime is under attack by imperialism, therefore we're going to support everything the regime does. The problem is that the regime's character, its very nature, and its strategy in the way that it wages war really undermines defense of the country. So what a revolutionary position, the task of Marxists really in Iran is to put forward a independent strategy, a Marxist revolutionary strategy for the defense of Iran based on the methods that can bring those masses to the defeat, including, for example, defending the right of the Kurdish nation to separate and have their own independent struggle. That will forge a real alliance, and you'll really have the Kurds fighting on your side to stand up for their rights, fight for the right of women, for land, for the peasantry. Those fundamental questions that really will give the masses something to fight for in the struggle and put forward a perspective that'll undercut the support of the regime in the population, which, to be honest, a lot of it comes from them being perceived as an opponent of imperialism, an opponent of Israel.
Yeah. I mean, the Kurdish question, well, the national question is always used as ploy by the imperialists to pit one group against another. And I think the Kurdish question has been a really devastating example of this. I think you mentioned that some Kurdish and women's group in this case either supported Israel outright in this war, coming from this position of rightly hating the regime for how oppressive it is against the Kurds and the women, but then arriving at the completely wrong position of then backing the Zionists and imperialists. You mentioned here the two-day party of Iran. If you can just explain a little bit, because on the one hand, you mentioned that they called for the defense of Iran, but then later they co-issued a joint statement with the Communist Party of Israel, which really undermined these words that they said.
Yeah, in a way, I think this is quite outrageous. I mean, it was correct for the Tudeh party to have a side in defense of Iran against the imperialists, obviously. But then to issue a joint statement together with the Communist Party of Israel that didn't even take a side in the war, called for the disarmament of all sides and condemned militarism on both parts, while Israel is bombing Iran. There's not a lot to say about I don't have a lot to say today, I think, about the tasks of communists in Israel, but for sure, Toda needed to make a struggle if they were going to have a discussion with the Communist Party of Israel to be on the right side and oppose the war of their own ruling class.
Absolutely. I mean, for communists within Israel to not say, like, hey, what our ruling class is doing is bad, don't do it, we stand with Iran right now. I mean, that's a pretty big betrayal. Right. So, I mean, of course, we're not on the ground in Iran. I can begin to imagine the pressures that the Iranian left feels. However, none of that is an excuse for really shying away from, actively polemicizing against these groups who capitulated to imperialism in this question, or to the mullahs. And ultimately, I think, and this will be a theme as the discussion proceeds, but ultimately, the thread that connects the different tendencies and their failures is what is the task of communists? For us, the task is really to take leadership of the anti-imperialist struggle. And now, if you're going to stand on the sidelines in Iran and say, okay, well, the regime is reactionary, we have no side, what you're doing is you're leaving the mullahs in charge of being seen as the defenders of the country. And if you're just supporting the mullahs because they're fighting back against imperialism, in both cases, you're basically saying that communists have nothing meaningful to say in terms of how we ought to defend this country as it's being bombed by imperialism. And I think that's really the fundamental problem, that what is the purpose? What is the purpose of communism, or communists rather? It's to try and take leadership and show how we have the strategy that will be actually able to unite the different struggles and mount a real challenge to imperialism in the region. But standing on the sidelines or outright supporting the regime just means that, well, what's the point? What's the need for communists?
Absolutely.
Right? Okay, so coming now to the West. Now, most of the Marxist tendencies tend to be based in the West, although not exclusively. But let's start going through the different trends that we saw in the West, especially, I think, in the US and the other imperialist countries. Let's just start by the outright social chauvinist capitulation. Can you lay out what this meant, and who are some examples of this?
So one example that we've talked a little bit about is the International Socialist Alternative, which has one of its largest sections in the United States. Mm-hmm. And in the course of this war, they put out an article that had a lot of material about the need for workers to struggle and the need for international solidarity and all of these kind of platitudes, which are perfectly unobjectionable statements. But when it came down to the question, their position really was that all sides in this war were bad and reactionary and equal. So what they did not do was to take a side between their own imperialist power, which was strangling Iran and strangling the Near East, mm-hmm. and the country that was its victim. It's really grotesque to capitulate this country, to equate this country that is devastating Iran with this country which is purely being the victim of imperialism in this war.
Yeah. And just for the sake of clarity, I'll read out the quote from that article. This is an article from 18th of June called "War on Iran Escalates as Trump Moves Towards Intervention." And you can find it on their website, internationalsocialist.net. And they write here, quote, "The only road forward is one of mass working class struggle against Israeli capitalism and US imperialism, and against the capitalist regimes which exploit and repress workers, women, and oppressed nationalities and minorities throughout the region," end quote. And as you've just explained, what this is drawing a plain equal sign. Israel equals US equals Iran. And, that's really to understand absolutely nothing about Leninism and imperialism. Like, imperialism, what it is a handful of powerful countries, imperialist powers oppressing the bulk of the world. And these countries have a right to their self-defense. And if you're just going to draw an equal sign, well, what's Marxist about this? I mean, that's as simple as it gets.
I just, to put it in context a little bit about what was going on in the United States, so the Trump administration bombing Iran was really part of their whole strategy to show, U.S. imperialism, it's losing power, it's weakening its grip on the world. By bombing Iran, they were making a show of force. They were drawing a red line to say any resistance to us is not going to be tolerated. So there was very little opposition to this in the United States at all, period. But just to start with the opposition within the bourgeois political spectrum. So the Democratic Party, what was their beef with this? Their beef with this was that it wasn't properly authorized by Congress. It was not opposition to the war in any way. It was just, we should have had a vote. Right?
Yeah.
Then there were more left-wing liberal politicians inside the Democratic Party, Bernie Sanders, AOC, who did object to the war. But their objection to the war was basically on the same grounds as the MAGA opposition. They didn't want a new forever war. They thought this was a mistake for U.S. imperialism. You can listen to AOC's interview about how this was going to jeopardize U.S. intelligence assets. It's all based on this same acceptance. The U.S. should run the world. Iran should be disarmed. They just had a different way of thinking that should be done. And that was really a completely useless as any kind of opposition to the war.
Absolutely. And then, of course, how it always works is you'll have the more liberal wing of the ruling class say these things, concretely AOC and Sanders objecting to this war on really reactionary grounds. But then you have the trade union bureaucracy who either said nothing about this and really just completely demobilized their memberships, or I think, for example, the ILAs, that's the International
Longshore.
Yeah, that's the Longshore president, Harold Daggett, said nothing. And I mean, maybe that's to be expected. That's pretty right wing. But the problem is you get this kind of whole popular front going from the wing of the MAGA movement to the Democrats to the trade union bureaucracy. And then you have socialists, quote, like the ISA, who ultimately, by equating Iran with the US, end up on the same terrain as their governments.
It puts them in exactly the same camp as this liberal opposition. Well, we don't like the war, but it's not taking a side against U.S. imperialism, which is fundamentally like, what is it you need to advance the struggle of the working class towards socialism in America is to fight against the leadership of the workers who support U.S. imperialism and support the interests of their own rulers. So this is what the ISA's position, obviously, was a complete rejection.
Okay. So coming to the pacifist trend, we've got a section titled Pacifist Obfuscation. Okay. So we're based in London. We went to the demonstration that happened a couple of weeks ago in London when the war broke out. And I think the overwhelming thrust of it was stop the war, no to war, hands off Iran, blah, blah, blah. And, from the point of view of ordinary people, that's understandable. But again, I think it's about what's really the task of communists when US imperialism decides to bomb the shit out of Iran. I want you to take us through what the problem with pacifism in this context was and how did it play out in terms of the left muddying the waters.
I mean, one of the things in countries like Britain, where we're located, Australia, a lot of the European countries, is that the bourgeoisie in those countries really makes their profits and their place in the world by depending on the American empire. And they weren't really happy about the idea that Trump might provoke a new regional war, a total explosion in the Near East. So they were talking a lot about the need for peace and negotiations and disarming Iran by other means. Of course, when Trump actually did drop the bombs, they immediately flipped around and hailed bombing Iran as an act of peace, which just shows their total subservience to the Americans.
Absolutely.
So, but what did you get inside the union leadership in these countries? And also that was reflected then in the left was this trend, which didn't oppose U.S. imperialism, didn't oppose the empire, but wanted it to proceed with more peaceful means, which of course is a total illusion, but also was a capitulation to the desire of their own ruling class.
Yeah. So when we say, like, some of the far left, they raise the slogans of stop the war, hands off Iran, I think we need to see this concretely in terms of you've got, Starmer being like, hey, let's de-escalate, let's calm down. What a slogan like stop the war does is, in the concrete, it really draws no fundamental political line between Westminster and the left. And it makes no clear intervention within the anti-war movement about what a revolutionary position in this war should be, which, as we've been insisting, should be to defend Iran, to fight for the defeat of US and Israel. Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think, at these demonstrations, I've gone around and talked to the different left organizations. And it's possible to make this question really confusing and complicated, I would say. And the RCI, which we're going to talk about in a minute, I think is a very good example of that.
That's the Revolutionary Communist International.
Yeah, the Revolutionary Communist International. But really, it's a very simple question. So Israel, followed by the US, bombed Iran. They made a war on an oppressed country, which has been strangled by the US for decades. Do you have a side or not? That's the question.
Exactly. I mean, if you were on the ground in Iran, that's what Iranians would be asking you. And are you going to say blah, blah, blah? Or are you just going to be like, no, yes, we're on your side. We're fighting with you. Simple. I think, yeah, you're right. There is a tendency to overcomplicate the situation. I think some of the pushback we've heard from members of the RCI is like, oh, well, we don't use these words, but we say it differently. And it's tricky with this organization because, I think any leftist knows that as of late, probably, I don't know, a year or two, they've become really the sort of most like in your face communist trend out there. They're like, communist flags, down the streets of New York and whatever. For them, they really react strongly to the fact that we're saying, hello, your role was to play the role of a pacifist obfuscation in this conflict. So I think to really crack some of their illusions about what their own position was, we need to go a little bit deeper. I mean, for me, one of the things that just stands out is you see the progression of their propaganda as the conflict evolved and as it ended. I think the clearest time when they came out and said stand with Iran was a week after the ceasefire. In this article, which is like, okay, good, yeah, stand with Iran, but guess what? It's over now.
Yeah, it took until the 30th of the month for them to actually come out with a clear statement that there was a side to be had in this conflict.
Yeah. But it's like, why is this a problem? They've got really lengthy articles that have all manner of analysis and all kinds of blah, 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 nice things. But again, this is really about what is your task as a communist. Let's just be concrete. At that demonstration in London, they had their own contingent. They were visible. So you're in this demonstration. I don't know how big it was, but regardless, within that demonstration, if people saw you as a force, what did they think you were fighting for? You were fighting for fundamentally not a communist revolutionary line, which took a strong position against imperialism and in defense of Iran.
Well, to be honest, what were those slogans? Down with the warmongers, hands off Iran.
Exactly.
It was indistinguishable from all of the laborite tendencies and liberals who were at that protest.
Exactly.
I would add, we did a different approach to that.
Yes.
We came with our own banner, which said stand with Iran, and we tried to form a block. I mean, it's not a good situation that the left is divided into a million small groups and everybody's very confused about the difference. So we tried to form a block on a very simple line. Mm-hmm. Do you have a side with Iran in this war or not?
Yeah. And the purpose was, again, in Britain, the Palestine movement is a thoroughly, well, its leadership is a thoroughly liberal laborite affair, right? And throughout, the task has been to put forward an anti-imperialist perspective within that movement. And this is what we tried to do with this contingent. As you just said, we approached a few groups. It turns out one of them was thinking along similar lines. So, this is FRFI, Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism, and a couple of other organizations. And we, made a united front on the basis of, okay, we stand in defense of Iran. And that, at least, especially to the sort of the Iranians who were at that demonstration, many of them took our leaflet because it was very clearly like in defense of Iran. Whereas, you had, for example, the paper of the Socialist Party, it was like down with capitalism or some other random general thing. So anyways, I'm rambling now.
I was just going to add a point to that, which is, I think you had alluded to this earlier. What is the basis where you actually can make international unity of the workers in the imperialist countries here in Britain, in the United States, and in the Near East, in Iran? The ISA, the International Socialist Organization, says, we do it by opposing all the regimes equally. The RCP says, oh, well, we just say workers of the world unite down with imperialism. In fact, if you really want to be able to make a firm, solid alliance, it has to be by the workers in the imperialist countries fighting against their own rulers' depredations and attacks in the region through concrete acts that make it clear what side you actually stand on instead of a lot of pacifist obfuscation.
Yeah. And I think, again, to just insist, it's the question of drawing that political line within the movement, within this movement that's dominated by liberal and laborite politics. And the problem, the fundamental problem with the RCI is that their position when this conflict was actually happening was not to do that, right? And, fine, you did this a week later, good for you. But again, this misses what the task is. The task is to really break the subjective elements, break the base of the movement from that leadership by showing how that leadership really is an obstacle to fighting for Palestine, to fighting for the Iranian masses and so on, but to then direct that fire against the trade union leaders, against those labor pacifist politics that dominate this movement. And the RCI's intervention did not do this. And in fact, what it did, we explicitly state, is it muddied the waters, because what you have is these nice young communists with their communist flags and saying revolution down with the billionaires, but it's really cutting absolutely no ice with whoever else is probably speaking on the stage.
Absolutely. I mean, if I was in the RCI, I would be demanding from my leadership to know this is a very simple point. So why did it take from the 13th of June until the 30th of June to be able to come out with this very simple statement, which, as their last article points out, is completely the way that Trotsky and Lenin and Marx and Engels approached this question going back to the very origins of the Marxist movement?
Yeah, this is a very good question. I think where was this wisdom of looking to the analogy between Italy and Ethiopia? Because that is a very apt analogy. And, I think Jorge Martin, who wrote this article, makes a very good point. I don't have any disagreements with that article per se, but it's like, where was this framework when this happened? Why couldn't you have just come out and say that?
Well, to be wise after the fact, the war is over. The time when it was necessary to make this fight inside the workers' movement, okay, it's still ongoing. But to come out after the pressure's off, after it's no longer in attention with a correct line, and furthermore, to neglect, that article has no polemics. Where's the polemics against the trade union leadership support for their own bourgeoisie, against the other left groups, the International Socialist Alternative that completely capitulated, against the Labour Party left wing?
Yeah. And I think to those members of the RCI who might be listening, I know some do, the point is it's really to understand, again, for like the 10th time, what is the task of communists? And as we've been insisting, it's not just to proclaim revolution and say slogans that say revolution 100 times or whatever else. It's to direct the fire against those obstacles to advancing a revolutionary movement. And that is where the RCI failed. And I think it's important to really understand that and actually wage a fight within your organizations. Ask your leaders, well, what happened? Why this evolution of these articles? Why were your members confused on the ground? And why did we have arguments with different people who were saying, oh, well, no, just class war or other different positions that we encountered on the ground? So this really isn't really impressive for an organization that proclaims that it's the real revolutionary thing. Anyways, enough about those guys. So let's turn now to the third world. What were the dynamics that played out when this war broke out within the third world, and what was the task of communists there?
Well, obviously the third world has there's a lot of different countries and different positions and come from that. It's a pretty big question, but just to try to break down in general trend, I think this question was posed everywhere by countries that are themselves oppressed by imperialism. Mm-hmm. How do you take the situation and use it to advance the struggle against imperialism? And in these countries, to advance national liberation at home, as well as the struggle against U.S. imperialism on an international basis. And I think one of the big issues that the left in these countries got stuck on and fell down and had problems was this kind of, we call it a double game in the article, that the regimes in these countries were playing. They talk about the need for national development and sometimes anti-imperialism or opposition to the U.S. war. And at the same time, most of these countries are either closely allied with the U.S. or at most absolutely refuse to take any move to undermine the U.S. in the course of this conflict.
Exactly. So it's just either empty words that mean nothing, or in deeds, they're pro-US, right? So within that context that we see, as you said, of course, it's a hugely varied situation. And it's unfortunate that we have to lump everything together because, different dynamics play out differently. But a lot of the left, well, there is a significant trend in the left to just look to BRICS, the anti-imperialist forces, Russia, China, etc. And obviously that's a problem. Do you want to just lay out why the BRICS is a total dead end?
Let's be honest, looking at it, Russia and China could have done something to improve the situation of Iran in this war.
Or Palestine.
For over a year.
Yeah.
They didn't do a thing. Yeah. Did China say, well, our nuclear umbrella is going to cover Iran?
Nope.
No, they did not. They did not lift a finger. What did they do? They had some kind of empty statements that sounded just like the European powers about international law.
Yeah.
And which it's been totally proven by the events of the last few years to be completely bankrupt. Putin used the opportunity to go on waging his reactionary war of conquest in Ukraine. Xi Jinping in China, the Chinese Communist Party, proceeded with its general strategy of we're going to expand trade deals. We're going to promise political neutrality. It's completely the opposite of what any actual communist organization should do, which is to fight to extend communism internationally.
And, you'll have people like Lula, who's, I think, the most pro-BRICS of the BRICS people. There's really, it means nothing. Whatever Lula says means nothing. But I think it's the point that you have these kind of, quote, anti-imperialist forces who will talk against the US on the world stage, in deeds lift not a finger to defend the oppressed when it counts. And that really is a fundamental problem. It's not this long, overcomplicated problem of analysis, but let's be concrete. The genocide is in its 21st month. Iran was just bombed, and the, quote, international community did what it did, which is, issue some sort of condemnations or whatever, but nothing else, right? So for the left to look to the BRICS and not the independent power of the working masses is really a gross capitulation, and is really no way to advance any kind of struggles, whether immediate or for national liberation against imperialism.
Yeah, can I just add a side point to that? So there's a number of tendencies in mostly the imperialist world that point to BRICS as a reason not to defend Iran, because it's part of some kind of counterposed imperialist bloc. I'm thinking of, for example, the Bordiga group, the International Communist Tendency, who say, well, Iran is allied to this other imperialist bloc of Russia and China.
BRICS is an imperialist bloc, right? BRICS plus, and Iran is not. Okay, God.
We should not defend Iran. But I think the actual outcome of events has shown how completely crazy this idea is. Like, what kind of imperialist bloc? Well, it's junior partner who just gets bombed, doesn't lift a finger.
It's a very good point. Not so familiar with this tendency. I think, sounds absolutely kooky, but a complete problem. You do talk about the CPP, which is a Communist Party of the Philippines, sort of being illustrative of problems that certain left tendencies within the global South face, this sort of faith in the international community. Do you want to maybe just explain? Because I know the CPP, they're influential.
Sure.
Yes. And it matters what they say.
Well, yeah. I think what the CPP really reflects is this position that a lot of the left in the global South is in, where on one side, they're feeling the pressure, like the population in the Philippines, like in a lot of the global South, is really being squeezed by the pressure of the Trump administration.
Yeah.
So there's a real push among the population against imperialist depredation, and they didn't like this bombing. And at the same time, the CPP has always had the strategy of allying with the liberal wing of the bourgeoisie in the name of whatever national liberation is a bourgeois task, therefore we support the bourgeoisie. But I think this is really common across the third world. So what you see is that they correctly took a position: the Filipino population should fight imperialism and fight the lackey imperialist government, the Marcos government in the Philippines. But at the same time, they have this other perspective, which is the international public opinion is already going to push Trump back, and he won't be able to go forward. And what does that mean? It's really like pouring cold water on the masses. It's like, here's another solution, a way that this can be carried out in the framework of the existing world order without the masses taking the struggle into their own hands.
Absolutely. I know, I followed the left in India, and, the communist parties in India had basically similar-ish position, which is pressure the Indian government to not support Israel and condemn this and, do the things that the UN says are the right things to do, which is really to completely demobilizes, doesn't even begin to capture it, but it's really to absolutely disappear that the working class has a role to play in the struggle against imperialism. Okay, I want to start coming to a couple of other trends based on, arguments that we've been having. We haven't touched on this recourse to, we're not with Iran, but we're with the Iranian people. I think that was one way in which many left groups flinch from saying the most necessary elementary thing. We're with the people because the regime is reaction. It's like, we agree, but just saying we're with the Iranian people doesn't quite cut it as well. And I think that's a little bit more of maybe a sophisticated argument that they're pushing there. But I was wondering if you could explain, I've got this article here, for example, from this group called The Class Struggle. It's based in Pakistan, and their leaflet is called Neither Reactionary Mullah Autocracy nor Zionist Aggression, Only the Revolutionary Unity of the Working Class is the true solution to oppression and war. Okay. What they're basically saying is supporting either force, Zionism or reactionary clericalism, under the guise of defense is fatal for revolutionaries and with the Iranian working masses against their struggle against both the regime and Zionism. Now, this doesn't sound objectionable at first read, but what they're doing is the same mistake which we started talking about at the start, which is equating Israel with Iran.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely true. If you look at what would it mean if Iran actually inflicted a significant defeat on the U.S. and Israel in this war versus what would it mean if the U.S. and Israel significantly defeated Iran, the outcome is completely different.
Yeah.
A victory for Iran would push back the U.S. It would give more breathing room for the Palestinians. It would undercut the Israeli offensive in the region. The U.S.-Israel victory against Iran would be a step towards crushing any resistance in the region and more broadly to the U.S. around the world.
I think another problem with just saying, like, we're with the Iranian working masses, as you say, okay, it's one thing that the Iranian working class overthrows their regime. It's another when U.S. imperialism does. But again, in the concrete balance of forces, Reza Pahlavi, right, the son of the former Shah, he's with the Iranian people because that suits his aim of being like, look, I want to bring Iran back under the boot of imperialism. When we were at that demonstration, there's always Zionist provocations at the pro-Palestinian marches. And what you saw this time was, next to the Israeli flags was the flags of the monarchists. And that, those are the people who are like, no, the Iranian people want their Shah back, right? So it's like, if this is your slogan, this is what you're also sending as a message to people on the ground.
Absolutely. It's not just the monarchists in Iran who say this. Netanyahu can say it. Trump can say it.
We're doing this for you.
What does it mean? Honestly, if you don't stand in defense of the country against imperialism, you're not standing with the people of Iran, whatever it is.
Exactly, because those people would, I'm sure, like to have their country not be bombed. The subjective wishes of those people, the people that you want to stand with, is to, hey, defend our country. So you're actually, not in line with what those sentiments are. Anyways, I mentioned this just because I think left in the global south, one of the more interesting things about it is how they deal with the national question, right? Because they're constantly forced to confront simultaneously imperialism as well as their own wretched national bourgeoisies, there's often a tendency to go ultra left and be like, okay, you cannot defend oppressed countries because they're bourgeois or because the regime is reactionary. It's like, well, yeah, okay, fine, but we're not politically supporting them, but we are standing in defense of them. I think another such argument that is often raised, not just in the global south, but internationally, is no war but class war, right? And in a sense, this is kind of the most crude sort of baby Marxist mistake. But it's actually quite gross because, again, and it's not so different from the social chauvinism that you started talking about with the ISA earlier. But, I've been having arguments, for example, with Indian leftists who are saying, how can you say defend Iran? That's just reactionary support to the mullahs. This is the era of capitalism and imperialism. No state has a right to self-defense. Only the workers have the right to self-defense. Therefore, no war but class war. I'm like, I don't even know where to begin to explain the levels of things that are wrong with that. What are your views on that?
Well, I just, I think there's, I totally agree with you about this phenomenon. I think it's useful to think about the distinction between like the ISA that gets this position from just directly capitulating to their own imperialist bourgeoisie, and a lot of tendencies in the third world that do this as a reaction to the kind of Stalinist or Maoist program, which says it does in fact capitulate to the national bourgeoisie in the guise of fighting imperialism. So then what does this do is this creates a trend in the third world that just rejects the whole anti-imperialist struggle as a capitulation of the bourgeoisie and writes it off. And no, we're going to be real revolutionaries. We're not going to take a side with the regime. So those are both false responses. And the end result of them is the same, right? Which is, who is it who ends up with a banner of anti-imperialism? It's the Shia sectarian regime in Iran.
I mean, ultimately, I think, the different sort of problems that we've been discussing, whether that's social chauvinism, pacifism, the sort of pro-BRICS opposition, the Iranian people opposition, what's common to all of these problems is who's left in charge at the end of the day, right? What's our role as communists is to defend the country in deeds, in action when it's under attack, but to simultaneously fight for a working class strategy to defend the country. But all these other various sort of reactions to this war, what they've done is in one way or another leave the existing leaderships in charge, whether that's Ayatollahs in Iran, whether that's the Labourites in Britain, whether that's like the AOCs and the whoever's else in the US, or, the quote, international community writ large, etc.
Absolutely. And I would like to say, like, also the war is not happening right now. There's a stalemate. None of the fundamental questions have been resolved. And more broadly in the world, the US is very determined to maintain its empire at the expense of the masses of the global south, and particularly by targeting China. So I think it's quite important for the left to look at what the failures were that you laid out, why only a international proletarian revolutionary strategy can actually provide a progressive answer to imperialism and make a struggle over this question now.
Yeah. Speaking of struggle, I think struggle sometimes is posed most sharply when it comes to centrism. So we have the last section of the leaflet is centrism versus revolutionary struggles. Yeah, most tendencies, in our view, fail the test posed by Iran. However, a small number of tendencies, for example, I think it's the Trotskyist faction, that's a case in point, they're centrist. Now, maybe you want to just start by explaining, like, okay, what did centrism look like in this context? And what's the line between centrism and a revolutionary position?
Absolutely. So I think the thing about centrism in this context is that it made correct statements. Like, formally, it had an orthodox position, like with the Trotskyist faction. It took a while, but when they got there in the end, their French section put out a statement saying that we should be for the defense of Iran in this war. That's a correct position.
Good, yeah.
That correct position ended up not being coupled with a fight inside the workers' movement against those tendencies that capitulated to their own bourgeoisie, capitulated to imperialism, and didn't have a revolutionary position. So what does that end up doing? It just ends up being a kind of a left-wing cover for the capitulations in the movement instead of fighting to forge a revolutionary pole.
Exactly. I think this is really the thing. I think how we're seen on the left is often like, oh, you guys are always talking about other groups and always criticizing the other groups. But I think it's not because we're obsessed, but it's really how we see our task. You can have a correct statement in words, but just because we've got like now correct words going out into the world doesn't mean that they're just going to now slowly start to enter people's brains and take over, like this is just not how it works. There's all kinds of illusions that exist and that are actively pushed, by every other force. So it's really an ideological battle to defeat the wrong positions and defeat those positions which in one way or another lead you back to the bourgeois camp, right? And if you're not making those polemics, you've got the correct position, but you're not actually fighting against the wrong positions that are undermining the growth and development of a revolutionary movement in opposition to imperialism, well, you're stopping short. You're stopping short of mounting that revolutionary struggle within the left that's needed.
Absolutely. What was the big failure in this war was that the working class never was a factor in the conflict under its own banners. And that's the problem of the Trotskyist fraction's intervention, was that it didn't do anything to change the balance of forces, even though on paper they had a correct position.
Yeah. Fundamentally, I think the point is that this really is a call for a debate and discussion, because it's been a while since the US went and bombed another country, I think. Yeah. And the Marxists were nowhere to be seen. And that's not just true for Iran, but it's also true for Palestine. We've seen massive demonstrations in defense of Palestine in so many countries and so many cities across the world. But are they organized under conscious trade union banners? Do they involve trade union methods of struggle? Or do we see, huge general strikes to stop a genocide? Do we see that the Marxists and the communists have taken the leadership of the Palestinian struggle? I think if anybody honestly answers those questions, the answer is a no. Right. So what this is really is a wake-up call that, look, this is a stalemate. The US is hell-bent on getting the rest of the world in line. And there is a real need for the Marxists in the world, all these different tendencies to take stock of what was posed in this war, what went wrong, both with their own positions as well as with the other positions, and to thrash out these differences and not just carry on, with their heads buried in the sand, shouting revolution or whatever else is going on, because this is really the way to just condemn yourself to continued irrelevance and impotence. I mean, that's kind of, I think, the words that I would like to just end on. I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Okay.
Yeah. So, as we say, central lesson of Leninism is to split the workers' movement from social chauvinism, pacifism, and any conciliation. And that's what we've sought to do with this episode, with this leaflet that we've published. I encourage, I'll link it in the show notes. Do read it. And, we'll keep hammering on these points, and we're more than happy to have debates with whoever is listening and other tendencies on what the correct thing to do with Iran was. So on that note, I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.